Welcome to DarshanTalks, powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. I'm here with the famous or infamous Ashley Preston. I'm excited to have him. We're going to be talking about meetings and FDA meetings and how to plan for them and how to go from them. But before we start discussing that, Ashley, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Ashley Preston. I have the privilege of leading the team at Syros Pharmaceuticals, who are responsible for regulatory, quality, medical writing, and operational excellence.
So Ashley, you have a wide range of responsibilities. I guess one of the things we're going to talk about is just the type of issues you get into, specifically around FDA meetings. Now, my first question for you is, Syros is it a commercial or pre-commercial company?
Pre-commercial in the clinical.
Pre-commercial. So is it primarily investor owned or is it publicly owned?
Publicly listed, yes.
It's publicly listed.
Yes.
Have you had experience with companies that are primarily investor?
Not myself, no.
Okay.
Yes.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is when you are responsible to a quarterly report from the SEC or the like, or for the SEC or the like, how do you start preparing so that there's something in there to show progress and you've got management, technically you are management, but still the people working with you breathing down your neck saying, show me that there's improvement, show me that there's a meeting with the FDA. When do you start planning these meetings? What are you looking for?
Yes, absolutely. A lot to unpack. Thankfully for us, we have a great legal team who manage all the SEC filings, and we act as SMEs to provide them with the fodder that they need to make sure that we're delivering to SEC what is needed and therefore onto shareholders the information that's required at the right time. But if we think about how do we think about FDA meetings and meetings with any agency, in fact, EMA included there as the two predominant regulatory agencies who companies in the clinical space would be meeting with. I think it's important to really make sure that you are engaging with the agencies at the right time and in the right way. And when you engage with them, you go into every engagement with the right mindset and sort of style of communication that is going to lead you to the best outcome. So we step all the way back. Let's focus FDA first. There are certain meetings which are required and or highly recommended. So pre-IND meetings are not a requirement, but are highly recommended these days. And I'm not sure that I myself would go into an IND without a pre-IND meeting these days, because it really is quite beneficial to understand any of the roadblocks, any of the pitfalls, any gaps that you may have in your preclinical program and in your plan for filing that IND before you actually go into the filing process. Because the last thing you want to do is be on clinical hold for something that could have been negotiated and managed pre-IND, because that is a bit of a disaster. You don't want to be in that space. You also don't want to spend a lot of time. It's critical when you're filing the IND. You really want to get moving with your study as soon as possible, and so you don't want to be in protracted negotiations within that time pressure for you and the agency within that 30-day clock to work out issues that again could have been managed upstream at a pre-IND meeting. So I think that first meeting is critical. And then once you're in the IND phase and you go through your end of phase one, can be plus or minus. I mean, it's optional, but it's really advised to make sure that you are taking forward the data and the right dose into phase two studies. And this speaks a little bit to Project Optimus, which has come out of FDA in the last a couple of years, and we saw this year the actual guidance around that. FDA is taking a much greater focus on making sure that companies properly explore and optimize their dosing strategy going into phase two in the oncology space, recognizing that racing to MTD and hitting patients with MTD doses of oncology compounds now is not always the best approach. And often, and there's evidence that suggests now that if you're at MTD, the toxicities may actually lead patients down the track to not be able to stay on therapy for long enough to derive the full benefit from that product. So therefore, taking forward a more optimized dose, a lower dose than your MTD, may actually enable a greater efficacy outcome, a superior efficacy outcome, because patients can stay on that drug for longer. So thinking about that, at the end of phase 1, you want to have as robust a package as possible to take to FDA and to discuss your plan forward into phase 2.
But you're talking about, first of all, for those people who don't know, MTD is maximum tolerated dose. And in the world of regulatory, you need to have a sense of that. But interestingly enough, in oncology, where you are literally dealing with controlled poisons, which is most of drugs anyways, but to the extent they're controlled poisons, you are dealing with this idea that you have to give the dose that'll kill the cells, but not kill the cancer, but not the rest of your cells. My question for you is, you use the term to get superior efficacy. And one of the key things we've discovered now is this whole idea that superior efficacy is not just a number-to-number comparison, but now patients are getting more and more involved. As you're planning these meetings, especially for a phase 1 study, are you bringing patients into that conversation, or are you doing these conversations sort of in these early stages without patients?
So it's case dependent on whether there's an actual patient voice per se, but certainly the underlying consideration is around the patient journey through the clinic and in that particular indication. And often enough, your phase 1 oncology study will be in a broad range of tumor types, almost in all comers, or maybe some targeted tumor types where your preclinical data suggests there may be some potential benefit. But you're always thinking about the future expansion of the phase 1 studies or into phase 2, where you hone in a bit more on your therapeutic area target, your tumor type or tumor types. You're thinking about the patient journey within that cancer. What does a PDAC patient experience during their patient journey? What does an AML patient or leukemia patient experience during their journey? And how can you best address their particular needs of that patient population within your development program? That's certainly an underlying key consideration. But at the early stage, you're also wanting to really explore the pharmacokinetics, the clinical pharmacology of your drug, to make sure you can dose it safely, make sure you tie down a regimen that is safe and potentially effective. You might get a little bit of early activity data out of that, but predominantly your phase 1 should be looking at how you can most effectively dose that drug safely in patients, so that you can land upon a dose to take forward into phase 2, or doses to take forward into phase 2 that are most effective. But you mentioned that the MTD, maximum tolerated dose, has traditionally been used with cytotoxic chemo, the original chemo. You think of the race to maximum tolerated dose because you want to hit the cancer with as much of that drug as you can, but without toxicities that make it impossible for the patient to take the drug. Now with targeted therapies, patients will be on therapy for much longer, and so you want to make sure that is a tolerable dose in the long run, so that patients can stay on that therapy and get the maximum possible benefit, because there's no point giving them a drug that they can only tolerate for a short period of time. They have to come off, and then they end up relapsing or progressing. Whereas if you take a lower dose forward, they can stay on for longer and get the most benefit out of that product.
Now it's interesting, and I guess we're doing this more horizontally than vertically. But I have to ask, you talked about the FDA, and we're talking about this idea of having patients stay on longer so that they don't have to keep having repeat cycles, if you will. The question that then comes out is there a fundamental difference about how you approach this question of maximum tolerated dose culturally? And the reason I ask this question is, when you're coming at it from the US, the goal is, you know what, hit it hard, hit it fast, and finish it. I've always heard that the goal in Japan is hit it slow, hit it chronically, and kill it over time. The idea being, up there, quality of life is much more important than in the US, where we want to move on. We want to get back to our regularly scheduled lives. And Europe is somewhere in the middle. But I would love your take on it. This is more a, I heard about this, I learned about this. You have hands-on experience. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, certainly in broad strokes, we do see that Japan will often approve a lower dose of a given drug for their population. I believe that that comes somewhat from that philosophy of a more tolerable dose over a longer period of time. But I also believe that they are very attuned to differences in exposure. So, in the Japanese population, differences in the pharmacokinetic profile of a drug, the metabolism of a drug can be different between different populations. There's a whole ICH guidance on ethnic sensitivity to different molecules, and there are some classic examples there where drugs are metabolized very differently, and therefore a Japanese population, for instance, or maybe an Asian population may have a higher exposure to a drug, which would then lead to a lower dose being prescribed or being approved, because to reach the same efficacious exposure in the blood, you only need a lower milligram pill, if you like, for that population. So I think that has driven a lot of that philosophy. But we do see some transition in that, if you like, in the US now with Project Optimus to recognize the length of time on therapy is as critically important as the dose that you can give patients. So I think it makes sense, and we may see some convergence there as more targeted molecules are developed. I think maybe they're able to be tailored in a way such that there is actually one dose across globally. I think that maybe with less and less of a differentiation in dosing as we understand more about how to design molecules and the metabolism of those drugs.
So I kind of have to jump into that and ask this question then. From your perspective, then, as you start preparing for your meeting, are you trying to reconcile possible dosing strategies from across the world, or is it too early to do that because you're still in phase 1?
It's again dependent on the drug. There's a lot you can glean from the preclinical data and the in vitro experiments around cytochrome P450 metabolism that could lead you to some indicators as to whether or not there is likely to be an ethnic sensitivity in different populations. And I would say by and large, there's generally not. So it's really the outliers where drugs are significantly different in those populations or behave differently. So I think by and large, you try to really maximize the benefit for the patient overall and really understand the full exposure response and exposure safety relationship of your molecule in that phase 1 study. Something else that is important to do, and we see sponsors doing this more often now, is also to really understand the QT, so the QT and QTC prolongation potential for your drug as early as possible. And something that we did at Syros was in that with one of our programs, SY5609, we incorporated the QT assessment into the phase 1 study because it enables you the opportunity to study QT at multiple different dose levels. Of course, your phase 1 study has many more dose levels than you would have in later development. And so it gives you that a much more comprehensive understanding of the drug itself in terms of its potential or otherwise effect on QT. So that's another opportunity to get data early to really understand the exposure safety and the exposure activity, if you like, of your drug, which gives you a much better picture when you move into later stage studies. It enables you to hone in on the best possible therapeutic indications, and overall, I think, draw more efficiency in your drug development program, even though at a point in time, Project Optimus for Oncology is now expanding the size, if you like, of your phase 1 and phase 2 programs by introducing multiple phase 2 doses. But I believe overall, what we will see is a more efficient total drug development program. It's just getting our head around that paradigm. That's not simply a race to MTD and take one dose. It feels faster, but I think we have a better picture overall and will result in a better outcome for patients at the end of the day, which is what we're trying to achieve.
It's interesting to me. I'm bringing in a little bit of my pharmacy background here as I have this conversation, but I'm sort of wondering a little bit when you're talking about your phase 1, your pre-IND meetings. What are the key indicators that you are talking to the FDA about? Obviously, it'll be influenced by your preclinical studies, so that's a given. But you mentioned QTC prolongation, which is, again, we know is something you're looking out for. The other one I know of is like DILI, because I know FDA cares about deliver and the like. GFR, creatinine clearance impact is another one. Are there any other key markers that the FDA wants to know about this early in the game because they know that, you know what, these are going to be no-goes, if you will?
Yeah, so you want to hit on all of the factors that might play into the inclusion and exclusion criteria for your proposed phase 1 study. So you're right, creatinine clearance, we want to understand as much as possible about the potential metabolic pathways, because then that would lead to exclusion of other medications that may have a potential drug interaction, drug interaction, because of course at that early stage you haven't studied that clinically. And we're talking about your first in human study. You want to be as careful as possible to make sure you're controlling that environment. And then on follow-on studies, you would then take a look at the DDI potential across various areas, across the CYPs, acid-reducing agents and BCRP and the multitude of different factors that can contribute to drug metabolism and ADME.
So we talked about sort of you prepping for this. You mentioned 2 other components as we're prepping for these meetings. My first question is around, so you've got your data. Now, from a stylistic perspective, do you come at this from a reconciliatory perspective where you go, FDA, you help us figure out what we need to do? Is it a collaborative perspective there? Or is it an advocacy type perspective where you're going, here's the direction we want to go, here's our justification for the direction we want to go. FDA, do you have any concerns?
Yeah, that's a critical point and really is a key success factor in the way we interact with FDA and other agencies. My approach, and the one that I try to propagate throughout any organization and my team, is a collaborative approach in the sense that folks at FDA, they get up in the morning, they brush their teeth, they go to work, they have a responsibility to ensure that medicines that come to the American population, in the case of FDA, are safe, effective, but also timely access. So it is part of their mandate to make sure that new medicines come to the public in a timely manner to treat unmet medical needs. And so we have a similar, the same mission, if you like, to bring our medicines to patients as rapidly as possible and to make sure that they are safe and effective. So those two are largely aligned. Now, we look at it from slightly different perspectives, but if you approach that discussion as a partnership to get new drugs into the hands of physicians who can deliver them to patients and derive benefit, that's the best possible mindset to take. But when you think about how do we approach a challenging topic, if you like, with FDA, we want to approach it with the sense that we take the science, we take our logical arguments, and regulatory is central to that, to bring together the pieces of information from the SMEs in a particular area. Let's pick again on ClinPharm. The clinical pharmacologists have the SME knowledge, they have the data, they have the understanding of the regulations as well, and so we work together to craft the best justifications, craft a story, if you like, to bring the reviewer along for the journey for our particular molecule, and to make the proposals that we believe are correct scientifically and logically and are reasonable to put forward in terms of studying this drug in a patient population. And it's okay to be not aggressive in the sense, but to push the envelope, if you like, with what you want to achieve, if it's bounded in and has a basis in logic and science. And you can push that envelope and really try to push for the most streamlined program that you believe will still deliver the data in a safe and compliant way, such that FDA can use that data to make regulatory decisions. And so if you do that, it becomes a negotiation with FDA, and you always end up with the best possible outcome in that scenario. Now that's very different to what might be your best desired outcome, but it's going to be the best possible between you and FDA. So that's an important distinction. Sometimes you get exactly what you like. Sometimes you get, very different to what you'd like. But if you take that approach, you always get what is the best possible outcome from that interaction. And that is what it is. And there's always the opportunity to go back if you have new data. FDA will always give you an audience. I mean, that's part of their responsibility. But if you go back, we know the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. But if you have new data or new data comes to light, you progress your program, you can revisit topics if you have a reasonable and justified argument for doing so. And that's a different situation to just being bullheaded and argumentative. So that's a really important distinction when you engage with FDA and any other agency for that matter.
I'm going to sort of add on to what you're saying. I'm not sure I agree or disagree as much as add on. And I guess the component of adding on, this is coming from a legal perspective, an advocacy perspective, and my thought process would be, a camel is a horse designed by committee, and and the idea that if you go, the FDA doesn't give you an unlimited amount of time to go hang out with them, and let's collaboratively come up with the best option here. You get a half hour, you get an hour from the FDA. You're going to go to them with pointed questions. You're going to go, here's, at least that's usually how I design these meetings, but this is how we're going to approach these things going forward. So you don't want to go in there with open-ended questions of how do we tackle this. You come at this with, here's the direction we're pursuing. Here's why we think this is the right direction, to the point you're making. So to the point I was thinking about, you're collaborative in that you're not bullheaded about it, but you're not collaborative in that you're open-ended about it.
Correct.
So,
absolutely agree. Absolutely, because it's not FDA's job to teach you how to develop drugs. It's
exactly.
FDA's job to regulate the development of drugs. And so absolutely, fully agree with you there. What you want to say, we believe that this is the right approach to develop X drug in this population in this type of study, and we believe it for these reasons.
Right.
Do you agree? And
right.
in fact, in my experience, whether or not you get a yes or a no from FDA on that, they are obligated to answer the question you ask. So right. Typically there'll be a yes and some information, or even when there's a no, with no because, and you learn something there. And in particular, when you have the luxury, if you like, of an engagement with FDA where you're live, you get your preliminary responses from FDA. They may say no because of X, Y, and Z, and you have the opportunity to then discuss and further negotiate, if you like, on what the X, Y, and Z are that led them to that conclusion. And you can flip them at times, or you learn something more and you find an alternative way. And that's what regulatory affairs is, to be honest, Darshan. It's the GPS. There's always a way to navigate through. It's just sometimes finding the best path can be challenging, but it's a worthy pursuit.
And that's the interesting thing, right? This is the most fun you have, I guess, as much as a regulatory person and a lawyer can have. But this idea,
we're fun. Come on,
we're exciting.
Yeah.
But this idea that you go in now, not the person I thought I would be quoting, but Dick Cheney said, "You go." No one thought I would get to Dick Cheney, but to quote someone else, no one expected the Spanish Inquisition. So to quote Dick Cheney, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. This, I think, was for the Gulf War, the second Gulf War. But the point I'm making is, who do you bring into that meeting with the FDA? Do you say, for example, and as the lawyer, you bring the lawyers in? And I would generally say, no, you don't want to bring the lawyers in because it changes the temperature. No one really, because then they have to bring their lawyers in. And this is not a legal meeting. Or do you go in there with the regulatory people so you can stick to the regulatory conversation? Or do you bring in the SME because they understand the topic? Or do you bring in the CEO because he or she can define and agree to certain terms? Or do you bring in a totally different team? How do you make that decision? How do you decide who will be in on that conversation?
So, rule of thumb, you bring whoever absolutely needs to be there to be able to discuss and deliver the best outcome in that engagement with FDA. So, typically speaking, it's regulatory, of course, and the SMEs, because the regulatory team understands, of course, the full gamut of the science around a particular product, but not to the depth that the SMEs understand it, and not to the depth that in a particular subject matter area, for instance, again, clinical pharmacology or clinical science or CMC, the regulatory folks may not have that depth of knowledge as your own in-house CMC folks or clinical pharm folks and the clinical pharmacologists on FDA side. So it can be good. And stats is another great example. I mean, I'm no statistician by any means. So if we're talking stats, I'm bringing our statistician and they will speak stats with the FDA statisticians, and then we will interpret as best we can and make sure that the conversation goes in a good direction and to kind of steer the boat. But it's important to have that, because otherwise you're really having a sort of a very superficial conversation unless you have the expertise on both sides who can really think through an issue and discuss in a particular topic area. So it's definitely those two. The lawyers, Only if it's a legal topic, and the commercial CEO or the CEO, I would say typically not, simply because it's a different frame of discussion. You really want to engage engage the agencies scientifically and clinically in that topic. So it's probably not necessary unless there's some other high level topic that you're discussing. And typically, it's probably, if the CEO is coming, probably the lawyers are coming too.
That's probably fair. If your CEO is coming, PR is in the room somewhere listening to something. But anyways, the point I guess I'm also trying to me, the closest thing we have to magicians in current society is statisticians, because no one knows what they do. They know what they do, and they're the only ones who know what they do. I don't know how many statistics classes I've taken. I still have no idea how statistics works. So I know you want to do your chi-square test. You want to do your R test. I don't know what they mean. But anyways, the point I guess I'm also going to is, in the past, your meetings were guided by the room you would be sitting in. There's only so many people you can put into that room, and so many chairs, because you really don't want a standing audience if you can help it. But that's what guided it. In a world now where you are having these meetings on Zoom, does that change the flavor of who is actually in the meeting? And what I mean by that is, do you involve more people because you can?
I mean, the simple answer is yes, to a degree. I think that's and recently there was a FDA Ready conference, I believe it was last week, where FDA mentioned that for in-person, face-to-face physical meetings, their ideal scenario would be 6 and 6 people on each side, and it's confined by the space that's available. 6 and 6 could be challenging. I mean, we've had virtual meetings with FDA where they're more than 6 on both sides, so it's not necessarily not necessarily achievable in every case, depending on the topic area that you're looking at. The other thing that I like particularly about the video conference style meeting is that you do have that opportunity, and this is where a little bit of leadership development comes in, is that you can bring along people who maybe haven't been exposed to FDA meetings before, learning the ropes in regulatory or other functions, and they can sit in and observe and understand it. And you don't have that luxury when you're going all down to Maryland to actually meet face to face with FDA. It's far more structured in that sense. So it does give us a good opportunity for as a teaching and learning tool, if people are able to just observe how things happen, what FDA says, what the sponsor says, and how those interactions go. It's a fantastic learning opportunity. So I think it's a great thing to try and harness from that perspective, also for companies to develop their people.
Actually, we can keep going, but as you know, we are restricted by time, just like the FDA is restricted by space. So we will have to call it. But before we go, any last parting words you recommend for people who are planning their meeting?
Planning your meeting, think carefully about what you need to ask, and time the meeting when you have the data available to make the best justification for your position. Because FDA will often a response from FDA, if you don't have enough data, they won't be able to opine on your question. They'll be able to give you an answer because they just simply don't have the data available to support that. So they may say, well, it seems acceptable, but we are missing X data. So it's important not to simply have a meeting for the sake of achieving a goal to have the meeting, but to really make sure you're getting the best outcome. Because as you say, their time is limited, your time is limited. It's not an unlimited tap of FDA meeting time. So you want to maximize the benefit of every engagement with an agency so that you're moving your program forward towards patients.
Perfect. Thank you again, Ash.